All right, hi everybody, can you hear me? Awesome. So today, I'm Hart, and I'm going to talk about cryptography, security modeling, privacy, confidentiality, just a lot of things about securing blockchains from a cryptographic perspective. So some background, who am I? I'm a research scientist in cryptography at Fujitsu Labs in America. My day job is building secure crypto systems for practical purposes. I have a number of interests outside of blockchain, but I do a lot of work for cryptography for blockchain. And before Fujitsu, I was a broke grad student. In Hyperledger, I am an Ursa maintainer, I'm a TSC member, and I've been involved in some other things as well. So that's basically my background. With that in mind, let's move to the talk overview. So what this will not be today, this is not a talk designed to teach cryptographic techniques. We will present some schemes, but that will not be the focus of this talk. If you're interested in this, and I think if you're going to build blockchains that require privacy and confidentiality, you should be, I would really recommend the free online Stanford crypto course. Check that out if you're interested. Instead, what I want to talk about today is how to think about security for blockchain so that we can design practically secure blockchains, and how to use the cryptographic tools we have in Hyperledger to achieve best security practices. So this is what I'll focus on today. So let's start by talking about, just what people think about security. So at least for me, when I ask people about blockchain security, what do they say? You almost always get a response about tools or techniques rather than formal guarantees. So things like, I use ECDSA signatures, or everything is encrypted with 128-bit security, or only hashes and ZK proofs are posted on the chain. And I claim that this is usually the wrong way to think about security. So I'm going to start by providing some examples about this. So this is something I hear a lot from people on blockchains. They say, oh, we anonymize all users, so we're okay. So if you want to see my blood pressure spike, mention that you do this on your blockchain. So an example of why this isn't the best idea. So can anybody tell me what this is? It's my credit card history from earlier this year. So if we just go through this, it's completely anonymous. What can you learn about me? So you can see I have some purchases from some snack machines in the South Bay in San Francisco. I have a credit card bill for a restaurant in Sunnyvale, so you can probably start to guess where I work. You can definitely guess where I work, it turns out. Then you can start telling where I live. So I'm buying gas and I'm buying groceries in Redwood City. These places are located, and it does turn out that I live sort of in the average of these places. There's a receipt from the Stanford gym, so you can probably figure out I have some relationship with Stanford. There's a Redwood City gastropub. So again, reinforces where I live, and I'm taking Ubers around, so you can probably guess that I had some cocktails at the said gastropub. So just from this 5-day transaction history, which was completely anonymous, you learned that, I work in Sunnyvale, I live in Redwood City, I'm probably a Stanford alum, I enjoy beer cocktails. And so, there probably are multiple people that fit this week in the world, so it might not totally de-anonymize me. But if you had my transactions over the course of an entire month, you could probably pinpoint me individually out of everyone in the world. So what this means is being anonymous didn't really buy me much. And this is especially challenging in the permission setting, where I have to have some credentials to participate in the blockchain on the first place. And unlike, say, a public blockchain, where I can completely refresh my credentials every time. But this is even problematic in the public setting. So many cryptocurrencies incorporate privacy or anonymity techniques. People have no idea what they're doing about, what's the best way to have a private transaction. The guarantees are far from explicit, and there have been a lot of misunderstandings about some of these systems. So there's been a number of papers sort of analyzing the linkability or the traceability of some of these systems, which is sort of the opposite of anonymity. So this is one classic pitfall. So another one I frequently see is people who say, well, everything is encrypted or hashed. No data is given in the clear, so I'm totally okay, right? So has anybody here seen the movie Wall Street? Maybe? So one of the iconic scenes in Wall Street is this scene between Bud Fox and Gordon Gekko, where they are tracking down Lawrence and trying to figure out his activities. So you can go through the script, but if you remember the movie, there's a phone call between Bud Fox and Gordon Gekko where they figure out that Lawrence, who's a competitive banker, he's flying to Erie, Pennsylvania. He talked to some accountants, so they correctly deduce that Lawrence is buying Anacott steel. They make a huge amount of money off of this and cause Lawrence to have a loss. So it turns out that side channel information like this, which is the name of what this sort of knowledge is called, is everywhere on blockchains. So just because your data is hashed or encrypted doesn't mean that people can't learn about it. So transaction patterns, right? Even if we have fully zero knowledge transactions, the mere fact that transactions exist in certain patterns could break privacy or confidentiality. So here's an example. So I've presented two hypothetical complicated financial deals, and they have different transaction patterns, right? So if I'm just an observer on the blockchain, I can tell whether this T alpha or this T beta happened based solely on the transaction flow. I don't need to see anything. I can only, even if I only see proofs or encrypted data or hashes, the transaction flow tells me what happened. So what I'm really trying to say here is what cryptography you use is not equal to what security you get. So instead, when you're building secure blockchains, try to aim for more formal guarantees. So for privacy, instead of saying something like my users are anonymized, say it's cryptographically hard to distinguish the participants in any transaction from random, right? So you're laughing, but clearly what I did or what I showed you with my credit cards doesn't meet this second definition, right? For data security, right, we said everything is encrypted or hashed. Well, what we really want to say, and what we were trying to say, is it's hard to learn any information about any transaction on the blockchain, right? So the main point of this is to design secure systems, you should start by writing down the security properties you need, and then pick the tools you need to achieve the desired security properties. Unfortunately, for most of the blockchain development I see, this is the opposite, where people pick tools and then sort of just get the security properties they want. And this can lead to bad consequences. So, of course, you're going to tell me defining security is hard. Yes, it can be. Even for people who have spent their entire working lives studying cryptography, and I will leave this Easter egg up for anyone who follows cryptographic literature. But when in doubt, ask someone, ask a cryptographer. The Hyperledger Privacy and Confidentiality Working Group is actually a great place to get started if you're interested in this sort of thing. And I want to mention that weaker guarantees are okay too. So a weak guarantee with a proof about security is much stronger than just throwing potentially strong tools at a problem and hoping that it solves the problem. So, okay, well, we've defined what security means for us, right? The next step is to build a system that meets these definitions of security, right? And so this really is two steps. So we want to build a system and then prove it meets the required definitions of security. And yes, proofs are very hard too, but it's important to get right. When you have a system that has lots of user data, you really can't afford to not get this right. Again, lots of resources in Hyperledger on this. And so one of the earliest cryptographers and most famous ones to get in on blockchain sort of always told the story, don't get cryptography, get a cryptographer. So this is my advice for people who are looking to build such a system. And I would say that if you are building a system, in fact, that needs these strong guarantees, I'd highly recommend having someone with knowledge of cryptography on your team. So, all right. Well, I've kind of gone over a process and some points on how to design secure blockchain systems. What does this look like in practice? So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk about tools in Hyperledger that make this easier. And a brief warning about tools. Don't design your own cryptographic algorithms unless you have the background. And even if you do, don't use them until they've been peer reviewed. There are numerous examples in blockchain of people violating this practice with hilariously catastrophic results. So I don't really need to go into all of these because, you know, this crowd, people are probably pretty comfortable with this principle, but, you know, we still see people who make this mistake. So next I want to talk about Hyperledger Ursa. So the goal of the project is to build a modular, flexible cryptography library. And I think I've been scooped with this line by many other people in talks today. But Ursa is intended for, and certainly not limited to, use by other projects in Hyperledger. And we want to make it much safer and easier for our projects and people who are building on them to use existing time-tested and trusted crypto libraries, but also new crypto library implementations that are a little bit closer to research stage. So things like exciting new SNARKs or zero-knowledge proofs. So here's some links if you're interested. And I will post this slide deck immediately after the talk. So feel free to check these out. So why Ursa? So people have, mentioned various reasons. But sort of the biggest reason for me was that Ursa allows us to concentrate our cryptographic and security talent in a single place. The classic example of this not happening is we've had multiple Hyperledger projects that have attempted to implement pairing-based multi-signatures without really running them by cryptographers. And all of these projects have gotten it wrong. And while this has been fixed, we really want to avoid these kind of bugs from happening in the future. In addition, as Dan pointed out, Ursa will allow us to avoid a lot of duplication, so there isn't need for lots of implementations of the same protocols. So right now we have a number of projects with essentially identical signature schemes. There's no need for that. It only hurts security. So Dan briefly alluded to this in his talk, but I wanted to talk about the Ursa layout. So Ursa is split up into two modules, what we have called the base crypto-lib and ZMix. So the base crypto-lib contains basic cryptography wrapped in a modular way, very standardized crypto, and the goal is to allow developers to use standard crypto in a plug-and-play manner. So the idea is if you want to change between particular signature implementations, say, you just change a flag in your build and you can switch from, ECDSA to BLS signatures if you want, or something like that. On the other hand, ZMix, which is our more advanced crypto library, contains sort of more complicated, novel, and less standard cryptography. So ZMix currently has things like smart signatures, which are pairing-based, say, aggregate and multi-signatures, and zero-knowledge related cryptographic algorithms. And this is kind of a work in development, so you can't go download and use these today, but we hope to have them available in the not-too-distant future. The purpose here is to allow developers to use sort of cutting-edge cryptography for blockchain privacy and confidentiality, knowing that they're using secure protocols. So again, The Ursa Philosophy is essentially to concentrate the talent in Hyperledger to collaborate on a single crypto code base. So this is really three layers. This is the theoretical cryptographers, the crypto engineers, and the security experts. And really there isn't a single person in Hyperledger, or probably, well, very few in the world who can cover all of these levels. So it's important that we have everyone. One of our other goals is to help enable interoperability between blockchain platforms, and we do this through modular cryptographic interfaces. We also, well, hope to help Hyperledger maintain high standards for security across all of the platforms. And if this sounds interesting to you, please feel free to join. Again, we are an open community, so come to the meetings, join the mailing list, and so forth. So with this in mind, I want to show you an example of how you could possibly use Ursa. So suppose I want to institute the following security requirement. I want to say that no adversary that compromises less than K nodes should be able to sign transactions. And I realize this is a little bit vague, but this is something that could be used in numerous places across blockchains. So I'm going to throw some notation at you here, so bear with me for a little bit. But everyone here is familiar with basic digital signatures, right? I assume everyone should raise their hand. So I've defined some notation. You know, don't get too worried about it, but it's pretty simple, right? So we have a key generation algorithm, a sign algorithm, a verify algorithm, right? You all are familiar with these. So security, right? Intuitively, we can't forge signatures, but how many people here know the actual security game for digital signatures? Marta, anybody else? Thanks for paying attention. So here's to give you an illustration of what you want to think about when you're defining security, here's the game for digital signatures. So we have an adversary who's allowed to query a signing oracle. He sends the oracle message is M and gets back signatures, and at some point he has to forge a signature on a message that he has not queried. So this is all really simple, but I just wanted to point this out to show you kind of why it's important to think about security protocols. Because otherwise, you know, you might come up with a signature algorithm where an adversary doesn't get to see signatures, which would not be realistic. So going back to our original problem, which is the security requirement, well, what are we going to use? And I think a lot of people here can probably say that, well, we're going to use threshold signatures, right? So what's a threshold signature? If you're not quite familiar with the math, this is a little difficult to digest, but I'll explain it. So what a threshold signature is we share keys between n players. So any k out of the n players can create signature shares that when they combine them together, they form a valid signature. And that's all that this notation is saying. And again, I'll just put this up there. I'm not going to go through this, but this is, you know, what a threshold signature security game looks like. And, well, you can think about this kind of thing when you're designing secure blockchain systems. So that was a lot, if you weren't used to it. So there was no math, though, right? So a lot of people, when they think about crypto, get very involved in the math. But the proper thing to do when you're designing systems is to think about things at a protocol level. So how can people interact with your blockchain? What can they do? What can they learn? And incorporate this in your model when you're building a secure system. So now I want to talk about another tool, which is channels. How many people are familiar with channels in Fabric? Okay, awesome. A good number of people. So a security requirement for which channels might be a good tool to use is to say something like, no adversary who is not a party to a series of transactions should be able to distinguish anything about the transactions that cannot be inferred from the start and end state. So basically, if we move something to a channel, right, we're going to do a bunch of stuff and move it back, and an adversary shouldn't be able to figure out kind of what's going on in the middle. And this is a very useful guarantee to kind of avoid our Wall Street example with the financial deals, if you recall, T alpha and T beta. Well, if we use a tool like this, we might hope to make it so that an adversary can't learn which transaction took place. So for those of you that don't know what channels are, the basic idea is a channel is a subnet or sub-blockchain for a subset of participants to perform private and confidential transactions. So nodes not on the channel should not know channel-specific information. So how many people are familiar with Lightning Network? Awesome. So you can kind of think of channels as a permission version of Lightning Network. Not exactly identical, but it's good for intuition purposes. And the other thing about channels is they still require a pretty good amount of development if you want to get these properties. So here's a graphic of sort of what a channel use might look like. So imagine we have some typical blockchain activity. We're kind of moving along. And then all of a sudden, we move an asset to a channel. We escrow the asset in the original blockchain. And then, we can have typical blockchain activity on both the channel and the original chain. So we sort of proceed as follows. And then at some point, we want to move the asset back to the original blockchain and close the channel. So we do that. And the goal should be that only participants on the channel can figure out these intermediate states. So if we kind of look at the top channel, right, no one should know what's going on with that asset unless they're on the channel. So again, channels are a very general tool, but the exact security properties and definitions depend highly on how you use them and what you use them with. So be sure your algorithms with channels compose properly. Has anyone used channels in a system, in their blockchain? Yeah, so be very careful that your algorithms compose, because in general, composing cryptographic protocols is very tricky. And there's a whole field on this called universally composable security. We don't have time to talk about it today, but if you're interested, I highly recommend looking it up. And again, channels aren't quite ready out of the box. So you might be saying at this point, well, I've only told you things that have really weak guarantees, right? And you want strong guarantees. So suppose you want something like the following. No adversary should be able to learn anything about any transaction in which it is not involved, say, outside of traffic analysis. So it's okay to weaken your guarantees a little bit sometimes, right? We'll let an adversary learn the traffic patterns, but nothing else. So this is what's called a black box oracle, right? So things go into the black box, they come out, but you can't see what's happening inside the box. So the problem with this is it's actually too strong. And if we want to achieve this, we're going to have to make another assumption. So we're going to have to assume that no adversary can distinguish a certain trusted execution environment from a virtual black box. There exists something that will help us solve this problem that it's currently a Hyperledger lab that works with Hyperledger Sawtooth. And I will say, I'm surprised I didn't get any eyes raised or laughter when I mentioned this assumption, because this is a pretty huge limitation of the adversary. Many trusted execution environments are currently leaky sieves when it comes to things like side channel attacks. So what is a trusted execution environment before I go any further? Are people comfortable with these? Do people know what they are? Who's heard of Intel SGX? Awesome, perfect. So roughly speaking, they are processors that are difficult for an adversary to look inside, even when they have physical access. So here's kind of an illustration. So a malicious node operator with physical access to a chip shouldn't be able to do anything more than observe the inputs and outputs. And this is not quite a reasonable assumption given our knowledge of side channel attacks, but it's one still a lot of people use. So there's currently a Hyperledger lab called private data objects. And in a nutshell, what this involves is running all smart contracts inside the TE, which in this case is SGX. This gives you fantastic efficiency. For most applications, using SGX is not much slower than native code, and you sort of get best possible security. So ignoring traffic and transaction patterns, if you trust the chip manufacturer and ignore many known side channel attacks. But this is a Faustian bargain. So when you use cryptographic protocols that you know don't meet the model of security you have, you're playing with fire. So that's about all I wanted to say today, and I'm not too much time is left. So I'll just conclude and offer some takeaway points before answering questions. So the first thing I want to reinforce is that when you're designing secure systems, think about the security properties you need. What do you need in terms of protecting user data, protecting transaction confidentiality, and so forth. And then pick the appropriate tools to meet the security properties you need. Too many people today seem to do it in the opposite way. I'd also recommend using standardized and peer-reviewed tools. This pretty much goes without saying, but we see a lot of people not do it. And get help if you need it. There's help out there. So at this point, thank you for your time, and I'd like to answer any questions. Thanks.
Hi, so why would you choose the language Rust when implementing the URSA?
Why Rust? So Rust is C callable, is the short answer. Has a lot of good safety features, and it's relatively easy to port to other languages. I think Dave can probably give you a better answer because he is something of a Rust religious fanatic.
High priest, I think. Meet me outside afterwards and I'll give the Rust sermon.
Dave can convert you to the Temple of Rust. Any other questions?
How would you compare security models or attack vectors for different Hyperledger frameworks?
I think it really depends on the application, right? So the attack surface is really more application-based than platform-based. So it's what are you doing in chain code, what are you doing in smart contracts, more so than the platform itself. So there are attacks on platforms, but those are kind of orthogonal, and I really wanted to kind of focus on the privacy and confidentiality aspects, which are much more related to applications. Dave.
So if someone wanted to get involved with the Ursa Project, where would they go? And what are the kinds of people we're looking for to help out?
Great question. No. So there's a link to the project page. We have a mailing list, Ursa at list.hyperledger. We have a Rocket Chat channel, Ursa. So I'd highly recommend joining the mailing lists, joining the Rocket Chat, and joining the meetings. We have bi-weekly meetings. I guess they're Wednesday afternoon, Switzerland time. They're unfortunately early for me in San Francisco, but that's just life. So yes, please reach out. And you're more than welcome to email one of us too as well, if you're interested.
Just one point for the last point you mentioned, which was TEs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Could you say that they are the hardware equivalent of a nice, well-tested cryptographic library in a way, right?
So if you ignore side channel attacks and and trust the hardware completely, then they're actually much more powerful than anything we can build in cryptography today. So I refer to them as virtual black boxes. So virtual black box obfuscation in software has been shown to be impossible. There's a famous result from Boaz Barak around 2000 that showed this.
Yeah, because the reason I'm asking is like, at least if you use a library, a software library, you can look into it. If it's open source you're using, you can compile it. For hardware, so that it's a lot harder, right? So you really have to rely on the constructor. Normally it's fine, but it's very hard to do any sort of auditability if you ever want it without going down with a
Absolutely.
microscope.
No, you're correct. You do have to trust the chip manufacturer. And, you know, like the Intel guys here will give you a lot of good reasons why you should trust them, but...
half of internet runs on that.
Yeah, but, you know, it's certainly a viable choice to make to say, hey, there are some things for which we don't want to trust the chip manufacturer. You know, if you're moving some ungodly amounts of money, you know, well, maybe someone can use all of the physical hardware cryptanalysis tools, you know, shine lasers, induce the faults, all that stuff, and break the chip. That's expensive, but if the incentive is enough, then people will probably do it.
Yeah.
How did the smart chip in the chip and pin card compare with?
Sorry?
The smart chip
Compare with,
this Intel,
which smart chip are you referring to?
like the ones that go in our credit cards and all.
That go in, in credit cards. So SGX is universal. So SGX, you can do basically any computation you want inside. There are some memory limitations, and it's a bit tricky to handle those, but SGX is a universal CPU.
This might be an offline question, but when you have a lot of different parties, so say banks, that need to participate with each other, but only on, you don't want them to be able to see all of the transactions. We were planning to use fabric channels, but as the number of parties increases, you create another problem. So from a scalability and potential long-term architectural effects, you can't have 1,000 banks on a single channel because the 1,000 squared. So how is there any sort of generalizable recommendations that you might be able to put forward as a best practice?
Yeah, so I'd recommend opening and closing channels, right? So there isn't currently a really good mechanism in Fabric where you can close a channel and dump sort of the output to the main state, right? So this is what I mentioned in some of the slides, right? So if we go back, right? So channel opens, channel closes, right? So if you can sort of close channels and dump state, then you can avoid this sort of crazy proliferation because, well, if you don't need a channel anymore, you dump the state to the main blockchain. No one figures out, except the parties in the channel, what sort of happened in the channel. And you can derive pretty good security properties that way. And in my experience, it's actually much worse than what you described. Instead of 1,000 squared, well, what if you have channels what if you have transactions that need multiple parties, right? If all of your transactions need, 5 parties, then you're talking 1,000 to the 5 channels. So yes, I think that you need some kind of way to gracefully close channels.
There are also other technologies that are using the side database and ID. Maybe you can have a look.
Go ahead, Bawa.
Yeah, I mean, in Fabric, there are also other privacy protection technologies, including the side database and also the ID mix. They are new in the latest release. Maybe you can have a look. That's a suggestion.
Any other questions?
Hi, this is Mahesh here. I have a question on the private transaction data. The newer versions of the Fabric have that feature, and before that we've been hearing about channels. So could you talk a little bit more about the newer, those private transactions data? And we have also been getting the feeling that the channels probably might get phased out, if I'm not mistaken. So was interested in hearing your thoughts on that.
So I'm not probably as familiar with some of these Fabric-specific technologies as I should be. I can direct you to some of the Fabric maintainers involved in this, who can probably answer your precise questions.
Hey, so continuing on the transaction privacy thing, have you seen any developments in, I guess, any of the Hyperledger chains for incorporating things like ring signatures with Monero that obfuscate the different parties that are interacting in a transaction? Because that would kind of generalize the problem. So instead of having to go onto a channel in order to have private transactions, it's just kind of the default for the blockchain itself, that no one would be able to interact with one another.
Yeah, so that's basically what the goal of ZMix is to do, is to provide tools for things like that. So that's going to be a part of URSA. The problem with the approach of doing it this way is that it still reveals the transaction patterns. So depending on the security model you need, you might decide that's okay. That, it's okay if people see the internal transaction details. There's some applications where that's almost totally okay. So for instance, a lot of indie, there aren't complicated transactions, they're very simple transactions. So if we reveal some of the underlying transaction details, not a big deal. For other things, it's not so good. And when those things aren't good, that's when you need channels or something like that. So I think we're out of time. I'm happy to answer more questions. I'll be outside if you have any more, but I think we should probably turn the room over to the next speaker. So thanks a lot for your time.